And so that's what made her more complex, is she's doing things we disagree with, and yet we can see what led her to that point. Hello, and thank you for joining me here at Why the Book Wins, where I compare books with their movie adaptations. My name is Laura, and today I'm talking about Garden of Shadows by V.C. Andrews, published in 1987, and I'm comparing it with the Lifetime miniseries Flowers in the Attic: The Origin, which came out in 2022 and is directed by Declan O'Dwyer and Robin Shepard. So I covered Flowers in the Attic last month, and I did start Petals in the Wind, which is the sequel. However, I fairly quickly lost interest and stopped reading that one. I might return to it at some point, but for now, I'm really not interested in what happens with Chris Jr. or Cathy, so I opted to skip the books relating to them and their descendants, and instead I jumped ahead to the prequel book, which apparently V.C. Andrews began this book, and then she passed away, and so they had a ghostwriter, Andrew Niederman, come in and finish it. However, it is speculated that V.C. Andrews actually wrote none of Garden of Shadows, and it is 100% the ghostwriter, so I don't know if there's a definitive answer as to what came from V.C. Andrews, what came from Niederman. I'm not really sure. But Andrews died in 1986. And 1987 is when the first Flowers adaptation came out, as well as Garden of Shadows. And V.C. Andrews does have like a very brief cameo in that movie. She is a maid. But yeah, she died before that movie was even released and died before Garden of Shadows came out. And in Flowers in the Attic, I found Corrine and the grandmother, whose name is Olivia, the most compelling characters, and I wanted to hear more from their side. So when people commented on that video telling me about Garden of Shadows, which is from Olivia's perspective and tells her story leading up to Corrine arriving with the kids, I knew I had to read it. So thank you so much to everyone who commented suggesting this one. And I did like it better than Flowers in the Attic for multiple reasons. So first of all, I thought this was better written, but also it was written in a more mature way. And so that could be due to two potential reasons. One, it could be that the ghostwriter was just a better writer than V.C. Andrews, in my opinion. Or it could be simply because of the different perspectives, right? Because in Garden of Shadows, we are in Olivia's perspective, Cathy's grandmother, and she is much more mature and adult than Cathy. And so therefore the tone of the book is very different than the tone of Flowers in the Attic. And yeah, Flowers in the Attic, the writing style just came across as kind of immature. But I get that it's from Cathy's perspective, and she was young when she was in the attic. However, the book is written as Cathy, as a woman, looking back at her time in the attic. So in some ways you can say like, oh, the immature writing style is because Cathy is young, but then it's like, well, but she's an adult looking back, so shouldn't it sound more mature even if she is writing about a childhood experience? But also based on comments on my Flowers in the Attic video, people do talk about how Cathy, due to her time in the attic, she seems to have experienced an arrested development of sorts. And so even as an adult, it makes sense that she would still have an immature way of viewing the world, an immature writing style of sorts. So yeah, basically, I still don't love the tone and the style of Flowers in the Attic, and I still think it's poorly written. Whether or not that was intentional or if it was just because Andrews, in my opinion, wasn't a great writer, I guess it's hard to say. And same with Garden of Shadows. If Andrews herself had written this whole book, maybe it still would have had a tone and writing style I preferred better simply because it's from Olivia's perspective. So it's hard to say if Andrew Niederman is totally to thank for the better writing in this book, or if it's just the fact that it's Olivia's perspective. It's hard to say. But anyway, that is something that I liked better about Garden of Shadows. And another thing I liked about this book is that there's plenty of drama, don't get me wrong, and yet it didn't come across as ridiculous as the book Flowers in the Attic did in some ways, and it felt like something I could actually take seriously because it wasn't like one ridiculous thing after another or like one outlandish thing, one overdramatic thing after another. And so it felt, again, like something I could take a bit more seriously, which is not the case for the adaptation, Flowers in the Attic: The Origin. That show they add so much that was not in the book. And it is just so over the top and campy and melodramatic and soap opera-esque, and they just toss in every imaginable thing you can think of into this show. And so yeah, my opinion that the story is more grounded and can be taken seriously, that only applies to the book Garden of Shadows, not its adaptation by any means. But yeah, I also felt like the book Flowers in the Attic got kind of repetitive and was longer than it needed to be, whereas this book, it never felt repetitive, and I thought the pacing was well done, and I never got to a point like in Flowers in the Attic where I was just like, okay, like, can we get moving? With here, I didn't feel that way. Also, I did feel that the characters also were a bit more nuanced here, and again, they therefore felt more real. And, the show also, they undo this as well, and nearly everybody in the show ends up feeling pretty one-dimensional and caricature-ish. And by the way, I know it sounds like I'm insulting the show by saying these things, but I actually kind of loved the show. It's what you expect from a Flowers-related adaptation, right? Because it's very campy and ridiculous and funny when it doesn't mean to be. And so even if I'm saying what sound like negative things about it, it definitely is one of those where it's so bad it's good kind of a way. And again, like, it's just so ridiculous the amount of stuff they have happen, and yet it makes the story just so entertaining. So I would recommend the show, even though it is very different from the book. And with Flowers, I said that it's impossible to make a serious adaptation out of that book because the book itself is kind of campy. Whereas Garden of Shadows, they could have made a serious adaptation of this. However, they chose not to and instead made something campy. And maybe they did that because this is what people expect from something relating to Flowers in the Attic. So if they went the more serious route, maybe viewers would have been disappointed because when it comes to V.C. Andrews, I mean, her books like Petals in the Wind and the other books, it's just ridiculous the amount of stuff going on in those books, and it's almost kind of a mess. And so it makes sense that the TV show chose to make Garden of Shadows kind of a mess with all of the stuff they threw in there. And so in some ways, it almost feels like they're trying to be more true to V.C. Andrews by making it so melodramatic and messy and campy, I guess. But then, another thing that also makes me like Garden of Shadows is the fact that if you have read Flowers in the Attic, you know where all of this is going to lead. And so that just adds an interesting layer because no matter what Olivia says, you know how she will end up. And I kind of went into this book seeing Olivia as an unreliable narrator. Actually, unreliable narrator probably is not the right word to use because unreliable narrator is usually someone who is lying to us and mentally unwell, and so we can't trust what they're telling us. Where with her, what I mean is just that she's biased, right? And so kind of like, take what she says with a grain of salt because she's trying to convince us that she wasn't the bad guy kind of a thing, So that's what I mean when I say that. But we did see glimpses of her humanity in Flowers in the Attic, and then we see that here too, right? Because we see her before she becomes the cruel woman she is in Flowers in the Attic, and we see what led her to crumble away and become this type of person. And so, yeah, I really quite liked this book. I would definitely recommend it if you are a fan of Flowers in the Attic. I know some people, when they hear that it was mostly written by a ghostwriter, it makes them not want to read it, which is fair. But yeah, I personally liked it a lot. I liked it better than Flowers in the Attic, so I would certainly recommend it. And I would recommend the show too. It's 6 hours long, which was not necessary. If they just stayed true to the book, this could have been like a 2.5-hour movie, and yet they add so much. And so it's 6 hours long. However, it was very bingeable. I watched like 4 hours in one day and then the following 2 hours the next day. And I enjoyed watching it. So yeah, I would recommend that too. And from here on out, I will now get into the details of the plot, which means there will be spoilers going forward. By the way, these earrings are just so beautiful. I got them on Etsy. I will link to them in case people want to check them out. But this is my first time wearing them and they're just so beautiful. I'm obsessed with them. So to get into spoilers, there is so much to cover here, but I will start with Olivia and Malcom. So in the show, he is romantic with her while they court, but once married, he abruptly shows his true colors and makes it clear that he does not love her and does not find her attractive. And in the show, the first time they have sex, it's after they have this grand party, and he takes her from her room and brings her into his mother's former room, the Swan Room, and he rapes her there. And he does this repeatedly, always bringing her into the Swan Room. And he also tells her early on that he wants a daughter who he will name Corrine, which was the name of his mom. And she had left when he was only 5, and he now has this sick obsession with her, especially, I mean, he was obviously obsessed with her in the book too, but in the movie, they almost delve into this more perhaps. Like we see him just staring at her painting and being such a pervert about it. But in the show, Olivia at one point tries to leave Foxworth Hall, but then she hears about her father's death and how he left nothing behind, and so she therefore has no choice but to stay. And in the book, her father does die partway through. However, he didn't die penniless or whatever, and he did leave Olivia with an inheritance that was hers and hers alone, and so he does die in the book, but she never tries to leave, and it's not portrayed in the same way as the show has it. And in the book, when they are courting, so Malcom, he takes an interest in Olivia and asks her about herself, and she's very flattered and is like, wow, this man is so handsome and he's wanting to spend time with me. However, he's not very romantic with her. And even when he proposes, it's very straightforward. And after the fact, she's like, wow, that's cool he proposed, but that wasn't as romantic as I had envisioned. But then she tells herself oh, I'm probably being silly. Maybe that's only in the books when the men are romantic, so I should just get over it. And then later, Malcom asks her father if he can marry Olivia. And the father raised Olivia to be a very strong woman. And so the father is like, if Olivia wants to marry you, I support her decision. However, he makes sure to tell Malcom, this is unique to the book, he tells Malcom that her inheritance is hers and hers alone, and Malcom has no right to it whatsoever. And Malcom does hesitate for just a second before then being like, okay, I still want to marry her. Yes. And by the way, in the book and show, Olivia talks about how, oh, I guess everything I know from love and life, I'll have to learn from books, which reflects V.C. Andrews, right? Because that's kind of her experience, is she didn't have real world experiences, and so what she knew came from books. But also she's comparing herself to these different book characters. But it's funny because the one book she doesn't mention is Washington Square, because she was reminding me a lot of Catherine, which was adapted into The Heiress, which I have a video for. But that's a video about a very plain woman who is incredibly wealthy, and this handsome man takes an interest in her, and the father feels like the guy only likes her for her money. And so that's kind of what we get here with Malcom and Olivia. And yeah, The Heiress is fantastic. Washington Square, the book, is incredible. I highly recommend both of those. But anyway, so before they got married, she knew he wasn't the romantic type, but then also on their wedding day, his kiss is very cold, and she's like, wow, that was disappointing. And then once they get to Foxworth Hall, he just continues to be very cold and absent and makes it clear that he is not attracted to her. And in the book, early on, he finds her in the Swan Room, checking it out, even though he told her it was off limits. And so when he walks in, he gets angry at her, and he's talking to her about his mom and what a horrible person she was for abandoning him, and how she was also very beautiful, but she was so frivolous and silly, and I don't like beautiful women because they always end up being wicked, kind of a thing. And as he is talking to her about his mother, getting so angry, he's also getting turned on. And in the book, this is when he rapes her. And then later on, so Malcolm's father, Garland, brings his new wife to live at Foxworth Hall, and they end up staying in the Swan Room. And this is when Olivia sees that in the adjoining room, which is Malcolm's office, there is a hole, a peephole, so Malcolm can watch in and spy in the Swan Room. And she doesn't know if he made this hole when his mother was alive or if he did it after his stepmom moved in. But either way, she is disgusted. But in both book and movie, Olivia eventually gives birth to 2 sons. However, after the second son, the doctor tells her that she is unable to have any more babies. And Malcom is very upset because he really wanted a daughter. And so he is very angry at Olivia for not doing her duty by providing him with a large family. But then after a few years of marriage, Malcolm's father, Garland, writes to say that he is returning to Foxworth Hall with his new bride, Alicia. And when they arrive, Garland is in his 50s, but his new wife is literally only 19 and she is pregnant. Yet despite her being so young, they both seem truly happy and they are a breath of fresh air in this house. But even though Garland comes across so likable, and Alicia, again, she seems to truly love him and truly be happy, I just got to talk about their relationship, especially because in the book we hear the backstory on them. So when Alicia was like 5 years old, her father was in dire straits financially. And so Garland swept in and helped them, like he gave him a job or something. And so ever since then, Garland has been close to this family, and this family views him as their hero. And then when Alicia is 12 is when Garland starts taking a special interest in her. And then at 14 is the first time they kiss. And she makes sure, because we learned this when she is telling Olivia, and she makes sure to tell Olivia like, oh, and it wasn't just a peck on the lips either. Like it was a passionate kiss when she was 14 and he would have been in his late 40s. And then by the time she was like 17, 18, she tells her parents that they are going to be married. And at first the parents are not liking the fact that he's so much older than her, but they agree to it ultimately because they're like, oh, we've known him so long. He's such a great guy. And we're so indebted to him that we give our blessing. And so again, even though Alicia seems happy, the relationship still was grossing me out for a variety of reasons. Like it started when she was so young. And then also the fact that her family was indebted to him, it came across like he was taking advantage of the situation, right? And so he just comes across as kind of a creeper and a pervert. But maybe that was the point too. I mean, all of these men are kind of gross in one way or another. And yet at the same time, maybe this is what adds some more complexity to the characters too, because Garland, it's like, wow, like what a perv. And yet at the same time, he seems to actually treat Alicia well and they seem to truly be happy. So it's like, I mean, it's gross, but I guess he's a good husband, so that's cool. And Alicia, I think, she's just so young and naive. So yeah, it's a kind of a gross relationship, but at the same time, you're meant to like them. And it's also interesting that this is unique to the book. We hear how, in both book and show, when Alicia gives birth to their son, Chris, Garland is a doting father to this new baby. And something unique to the book is how Malcom is annoyed at Garland for babying this baby boy. But we find out that the deeper issue as to why Malcom is annoyed by this is because Garland was an absent father when Malcom was a boy. And so he's jealous, being like, wow, you were gone when I was a kid, and yet here you are devoting your life to this new baby. And so that added a more interesting layer to Malcolm's feelings about Garland and Alicia that the movie does not have. But Garland and Alicia are very open with their PDA, which makes Olivia jealous and uncomfortable. And in the book, she starts to spy on them when they're having sex, which was not in the movie. But in both, Malcom, at first he seems to dislike and be annoyed with Alicia. However, over time we see he is clearly very into her and, she's very beautiful and young, unlike Olivia. And in both, we have a scene where Malcom follows Alicia when she goes to swim in the lake. But in the book, Olivia had followed after Malcom and she witnessed Alicia telling Malcom to leave her alone as he attempted to attack her. And in both, Garland eventually dies when Malcom attempts to rape Alicia and Garland hears her scream and Malcom gets physical with Garland. And in the book, I think Garland truly did have a heart attack in this moment. However, in the TV show, they tell the doctor, the coroner, whatever, that he had a heart attack. But in reality, we know that Malcom actually killed him, and that's why he died. And then after Garland has been dead for quite a few months, Alicia tells Olivia that Malcom has been consistently coming into her room and raping her, and she is now pregnant. It is too long after Garland's death, though, for her to pass it off as his. And in the movie, this was a very ridiculous moment because Olivia in voiceover is like, I wanted to kill Malcom. And we see her grab a knife, and then we see her slit something's throat, and blood spurts all over her, only for us to then see that she had actually killed a sheep, because it was kind of wanting us to think she had killed Malcom. But yeah, it was just a sheep. And then from here, she goes to get Nella. I will get into Nella later. But she doesn't even bother to wipe the blood off before going to see Nella. And so it was just So dramatic and silly. But in both, Olivia puts Malcom in his place, basically being like, okay, we will pass Alicia's baby off as our own. We will keep it. After she gives birth, we'll send her away. Like, she comes up with this whole story of how they can pull this off. But she tells him, like, I call the shots, though. I am in charge of everything relating to Alicia and this baby, and you are forbidden to see her again, and you need to leave it all up to me. And Malcom agrees, and she then has Alicia stay in the same room that Cathy and them will later stay in Flowers in the Attic. And she has her there for 6 months, so from her 3rd month until the baby is born. And in the movie, we see that Malcom still goes to see Alicia, and so then Olivia sadly tells Alicia that the only way she can keep him away is to make herself ugly by chopping off her hair. By the way, I will get into this a bit more later too, but in the book, Olivia loved taking Alicia down a peg and like the thought of chopping off her hair, and she makes sure to do it so ugly, and she is reveling in treating Alicia this way. And I just want to read a few of these quotes that show how much Olivia loves having this power and control over Alicia. She nodded, now resigned to her fate. Speaking to her like this made me feel even more powerful. I couldn't be as slim and as beautiful as she was, but finally her beauty had proven to be a weakness and a fault. It had led her down a painful path, a path I would never choose myself. I could put a smile or a grimace on her face. I could make her laugh or cry. She was in my hands and as helpless as a little doll. The smile of hope evaporated. I felt like a puppeteer. I had pulled a string and turned her back into a state of depression. From this day forward, she wouldn't go singing or skipping through Foxworth Hall unless I wanted her to. She wouldn't be bubbly and alive unless I wanted her to be. Whereas in the movie, they make Olivia a more decent person in some ways and make her conflicted and sorry for Alicia, because in the movie, Alicia was someone she had considered her friend, which was not the case in the book. Because also in the book, by the way, when Alicia was pregnant with Chris, Olivia tries to get her in a situation that will lead to a miscarriage. But we see why she dislikes Alicia, and it's because she's trying to get close to Malcom, because at this point she thinks Malcom doesn't like Alicia. So she's like, if I can make her have a miscarriage, then me and Malcom can bond over that and how great it is. But then also over time, she sees that Malcom is attracted to Alicia, so then she has this jealousy going on and she resents Alicia, and so it's all very complicated. And yeah, the movie just got rid of all of that and made her actually like sad about doing this to Alicia. But in the book, Alicia goes through a range of emotions during her time locked up. And at one point, she also is like getting kind of delusional and maybe crazy. But then also other times, it seems like she's not crazy, but she is intentionally finding ways in order to make her time not so miserable. And so the cutting of the hair, as well as, the way she tries to deal with her time in the attic, considering this is a story about familial cycles and family curses of sorts and, generational trauma, I do like the fact that we have history repeating itself, right? Because Cathy and Chris Jr.'s grandmother, and it's not just a fraternal grandmother or a maternal grandmother, she is the grandmother on both sides. She herself was locked in the attic when she was pregnant with Corrine. And so the fact that their own grandmother had this experience and how so much of it mirrors, in some ways, what happens with Chris and Cathy, I kind of liked the history repeating itself kind of a thing. But in the end, Alicia gives birth while Olivia pretends to also give birth, because this whole time she has been pretending to be pregnant in order to pass Corrine off as her own. But then when she goes upstairs to see Alicia off afterwards in the book, turns out Alicia and her son have already left. Whereas in the movie, she actually does see Alicia before she leaves. Also in the show, they add more drama once again, because before giving birth, there is a scene when Alicia says that she's had enough and she tries to leave, only to then dramatically fall down the stairs. However, a doctor comes to see her and, the baby's fine, and then she later ends up giving birth. And in the book, Olivia doesn't know that Malcom wants to name their daughter Corrine, the same name his mother had, until they have the baby right there. And he's like, oh, she'll be Corrine. And Olivia is like, you mean Corrine as in the name of your mom? The woman you say you hate, who you were also weirdly obsessed with? Like, that's who you want to name her after? And he's like, yeah, because she's going to be beautiful, but every time I say her name, I'll be reminded that beautiful women like my mother are, evil and wicked and try to tempt you and control you. And so every time I say her name, I'll be reminded not to fall for her wicked womanly ways. And so that's why I want to name her Corrine. And so basically, Corrine was screwed from the start, right? What a twisted reason to give your child a name, and just what a weird man, obviously, Malcolm was. And in the book, as Corrine grows, he is very, overprotective, aka very controlling over her, but he also dotes on her and spoils her. And it does seem like Corrine actually does love him. He will also say things like, "Promise me that no matter how old you are, you'll stay with me forever." And she's like, "Oh, of course, Daddy." But then Olivia is more wary of Corrine because she sees how Corrine uses her charm to get what she wants from her father, but also from her brothers. And so Olivia tries to warn her sons, hey, don't let Corrine, wrap you around her finger, because she can be super manipulative, so you need to look out for that. And yeah, in the book, while Malcolm, he again, kind of like with his mom, he has a weird obsession with Corrine and is obsessed with her beauty. And, again, he's telling her to stay with him forever. It didn't come across, it kind of came across sexual, and yet we never hear about anything blatantly sexual going on. Whereas in the movie, this is different though, because first of all, he wants to keep her a little girl forever, and initially he's not acknowledging that it's she's growing up and she's going to make her own choices soon. But also as she is growing up, we do see him spying on her as she gets changed. And the way he is towards her, you can clearly tell he is sexually interested in her, and Corrine can feel this, and Olivia sees this. And so in the movie, Corrine actually is not that close to her dad because, one, she resents him for treating her like a child, and then two, as he gets creepy with her, she's very uncomfortable, obviously. And so in the movie, she's actually closer to Olivia than she is to her own father. And in the movie, or the show, sorry, I keep calling it a movie, but in the show, we also see that she is very close to her brothers, Mal and Joel. And while this wasn't true of the book necessarily, they got along fine, but they weren't particularly close. So even though this is an addition to the show that wasn't in the book, it was actually one of my favorite things about the show, was seeing the bond the three of them have. And in the movie, as one brother dies and then drama happens with the other brother, Corrine is heartbroken at these turn of events because they were so close. Whereas in the book, both of her brothers die. I will talk about them in a minute. And in the book, she's sad about their deaths, but after the second one, she's also kind of tired of being in mourning. And so she's complaining to her parents, being like, "Can't we get on with the life? I know they're dead, but come on, I want to live." And so she almost came across maybe a little heartless in that sense and a little self-centered. But in the book, I think she was younger too, so there's that as well. But in both, around this time, as things are happening with her brothers, this is when Chris, Alicia's son, comes to stay with them. And in the book, Alicia sends a letter talking about how she has cancer, and then once she dies, Chris arrives. Whereas in the movie, it's kind of a dramatic moment where Alicia turns up at the door and tells them everything. But yeah, here too, Alicia dies of cancer, and so then Olivia and Malcolm allow Chris to stay with them. And the movie makes an interesting change to have she and Chris have a meet cute in town, and they don't know who the other is, before then later that day meeting each other at the house and having the realization that they are related. But in the book, the first time they meet is at the house, and even though they know they are related, they can't help but be drawn to each other. And the movie gives us one-on-one scenes between the two of them, but the book is from Olivia's perspective, and so we don't see any of these moments. But in both book and movie, Chris and Corrine fall in love, and Olivia unintentionally walks in on them having sex. And something I need to mention from the movie that was not in the book is that before Chris, Corrine had snuck out of the house with Olivia's help in order to go to a dance with a boy she had a crush on. And the boy gets her to have sex, which leads her to be pregnant, and Olivia takes her then to get an abortion, and Malcolm was spying on them and knows this and yells at them later for what they have done. And so then after, when Olivia and Malcolm find out the truth about, Chris and Corrine being in love and wanting to be married, Malcolm tells Chris about this abortion, trying to get him to turn on Corrine and be like, she's not what you think she is. However, this doesn't work, and Chris still wants to be with her. Also in the TV show, Olivia tells them, like, hey, you're not just half uncle and niece, you are half siblings, so that is why this cannot happen. And yet that too does not deter them. And they're just like, we don't care. We love each other, so we want to be together anyway, regardless. Whereas in the book, they did not know. Olivia never told them. There are only 4 people who knew the truth about Chris and Corrine, one of whom was Alicia, who ends up dying. And so, yeah, they themselves never knew this detail. But yeah, so basically in book and show, it's the same, where Chris and Corrine leave the house and she's written out of the will and, they're like, I never want to see you again because this is disgusting. But the movie, of course, adds more drama where Malcolm tries to kill Chris pulls a gun on Malcolm, and, all this other stuff happens. But ultimately in both, as we know from Flowers in the Attic, Chris and Corrine run off together and start their own family, their own lives. And then in the book, that night, after he learns about this with Corrine and Chris, Malcolm then has a stroke, and it is so severe that he is wheelchair bound for the rest of his life. And he also loses his speech for a while, although over the years, he does regain his speech to some extent. Whereas in the TV show, what causes Malcolm to be wheelchair bound is that sometime after this, Olivia rigs a railing on like a higher floor, which causes Malcolm to fall, and it paralyzes him. And from here, she revels in torturing him. But then she starts to hate what she has become. And this is when she calls her religious cousin John Amos, and with his help, this is how she converts to Christianity in the TV show. And I need to now talk about John Amos because he is a huge, very influential character in the book who the TV show diminishes and changes, and yeah, so there's a lot to get into with him. So as far as the book goes, through the years, Olivia and John Amos were very close. They're cousins, by the way. And he was always very religious. And so through the years, they'll write letters to each other, and he provides comfort and support to her. And after the death of her sons, he will be there to, again, provide comfort. And eventually she asks him if he can just live with them. And she's like, your title will be butler, but you're going to be so much more than that. And so he agrees. And initially, Malcolm does not like John Amos. However, after the death of Joel, Malcolm sequesters himself in his office and won't come out, and he will only talk to John Amos. And this is when, with the help of John Amos, Malcolm in the book converts to Christianity and has this turning point in his life after the death of his second son. And so in the book from here, Olivia, John Amos, and Malcolm all become incredibly devout. And then in the book, when Chris arrives, which, by the way, in the book, Olivia and Malcolm and John Amos, they all see the arrival of Chris as God rewarding them for their newfound spirituality, basically. After Chris arrives, though, John Amos, he keeps telling Olivia that Chris and Corrine are too close and something sinful is going on. And he also makes comments that show that he has been spying on Corrine, being a perv, and Olivia calls him out, being like, what are you doing watching her brush her hair 100 times? Like, why are you watching her in her room as she gets ready? Like, you sound like you're being inappropriate. But yeah, basically she dismisses John Amos's concerns about Chris and Corrine. And then when it turns out he was right, she is like, wow, I should have listened to him. And so basically she vows to always pay attention to what John Amos says. And then when Corrine writes, asking to be allowed to return home, Olivia actually kind of has a softened heart about this. But John Amos is the one that's like, no. He's the one that starts calling the children devil spawn because, by the way, so the 3 people after Alicia dies that knows that Chris and Corrine are half siblings, Olivia, Malcolm, and John Amos, because after the drama with Chris and Corrine, Olivia is so upset about this that she tells John Amos, like, you don't understand, it's so much worse than you think because they're half siblings. And so he is the only person she ever told this secret to. And so John Amos is like, those children are devil spawn, and he is the one that encourages her to put them in the attic. And then he's also the one who encourages her to, like, be on the lookout for inappropriate behavior between those kids because, they're evil. So basically, everything that happened in Flowers in the Attic, we can thank this weasel John Amos for almost all of that. So he was just such a horrible character in the book. Whereas in the movie, again, John Amos doesn't show up until later when Olivia regrets who she has become and the way she's torturing Malcom. So this is quite a while after the stuff with her sons, after Chris and Corrine. So it's quite some time after that she has John Amos come stay with her and when she has her religious conversion. But in the show, Malcom never has a religious conversion. But then after John has been with them for quite a number of years, he ends up trying to rape Olivia and she ends up stabbing him and killing him, which again was so ridiculous. But we see how in the show, John Amos is a hypocrite because he's talking about how sinful it is to be with someone you're related to. And yet he and Olivia are cousins. So she's like, you've been preaching against this and now here you are trying to get with me. By the way, in the South, wasn't it common to marry your cousin? This is like the 1930s by this point, so I guess by the 1930s it wasn't common, but I know getting with your cousin wasn't the most unusual thing in the world at some point in time, but regardless. Yeah, John Amos is a horrible guy in both book and show. However, a lot of the details with him have been changed, and while in the show, I mean, he's a horrible person in the show, and yet he feels worse in the book in some ways because he just comes across as so sneaky. And, you know, in the show, Olivia goes from being under the thumb of Malcom to under the thumb of John Amos. So he is still very controlling and influencing Olivia to become a bad person. But yeah, just the way he influenced her with Cathy and Chris Jr. and all of that. Yeah, I don't know. It just adds another layer to how horrible his character is when you know what happens in Flowers in the Attic. By the way, the butler John from Flowers in the Attic is this guy. And in the 87 movie, the butler knows about the children. And in my previous video, I was like, oh, that's untrue because in the book, no one knew but Corrine and Olivia. But according to Garden of Shadows, the butler did know, actually. So I should have looked up when this book actually came out, because if Garden of Shadows came out before the movie, maybe that's why they added that detail, since it was actually accurate. But anyway, also I wanted to mention, if you are interested in movies that are, or books, sorry, that are like a family saga that delve into familial cycles and family curses, so to speak, and just the generational influences and generational cycles you can't break out of that also deal with incest to some degree, then you should read 100 Years of Solitude, which I have right here. That book is absolutely incredible. It's so fantastic. I have a book versus TV show video for that, but only part 1 of the show has come out. I'm still waiting for part 2. But yeah, so actually there's kind of some similarities between 100 Years of Solitude and the Flowers in the Attic series, but 100 Years of Solitude is an absolutely incredible 5-star book that's just so fantastic. And yeah, I highly recommend it if you want something that tells a story like this, but does it far better. But then something else I need to talk about is that prior to Corrine showing up at the house, of course, years before, in the book and movie, Olivia hires a private investigator to see what is going on with Corrine and Chris. And she learns that they have children long before Corrine writes saying she needs their help. And in the movie, this was Olivia's idea, but in the book, Malcom is the one. He becomes very subservient to Olivia as time goes on. And so in the book, he's like, Olivia, please hire a detective and find out what happens to Corrine. I can't live not knowing what has become of them. Like, please, Olivia, please. And so Olivia agrees, and the detective finds out that they've had kids. However, Olivia never tells Malcom about this, and so she knows beforehand. But yeah, Malcom is never told about the children. Once they are living in the attic, maybe he speculates that something fishy is going on, but we just never know for sure. I still say, especially based on what he wrote in that will, I mean, he was a very vindictive person, so he could have been doing it just for that reason alone. But I also suspect that maybe he suspected something. But yeah, even though Olivia hires a detective, she straight up, we read that she never told Malcom what was discovered. And then also in the movie, Corrine, when she arrives, she is surprised that her kids will have to stay in the attic. But in the book, she knew beforehand. Based on the letter Olivia wrote, she knew what she was getting her kids into. And so this is another instance where the show tries to make certain characters more likable, being like, oh, Corrine had no idea she was going to do this to her kids. And it's like, no, she didn't know. She didn't know how long, but she knew what she was going to ask them to do. And so I'm not a fan of the show making characters who were actually much more complicated and not totally likable and turning them into these likable characters. I find them so much less interesting when they're more likable, I guess. But now I need to talk about Joel and Mal, so Malcolm Jr., Olivia's sons, who she did give birth to. So Malcolm dies when he is young because at 18, well, okay, so first I need to backtrack because Olivia had Malcolm set up a trust for the boys when all the drama with Alicia was happening, and she tells him like they will each get $1 million when they turn 18. And when Mal turns 18, he buys a motorcycle because his father is very controlling and Mal is very unhappy, so buying a motorcycle is his way of rebelling. And of course, like soon after he buys it, he crashes it and dies. Whereas in the movie, they don't get the trust money until they are 25. And Mal, we see, is engaged, but he is not yet 25. And so he asks his dad for the money to help with, the start of his marriage. But Malcolm, of course, says no. And then the day of Mal's wedding, Malcolm manipulates Mal's bride to kiss him before the ceremony. And Mal walks in and sees this, and he then grabs what he thinks is weed from Corrine's dresser, but it is actually poison, and he smokes it and crashes the car and dies. And then in the book, Joel is very musically talented. And at one point he joins like a traveling symphony or something, and they're in Europe performing, and everybody's calling him like an incredible talent and the most amazing pianist ever. But then he ends up getting caught in an avalanche and presumed to be dead, and we never hear of him again. Whereas in the movie, Joel, again, he is musically talented, but here we learn that he is gay and he is into their mechanic, a guy named Harry. And Malcolm walks in on them kissing, and it's funny because Malcolm is super upset, of course, because not only is he kissing a man, he's kissing a black man. And so Malcolm runs to see Olivia, and it's an unintentionally funny scene because he's like, I just found the mechanic doing improper things to Joel. And Olivia is like, is he hurt? And Malcolm is like, worse than that, he was enjoying it. But anyway, it's not funny because from here, Malcolm has the mechanic, Harry, horribly beaten, and then he sends Joel off to a clinic to quote-unquote fix him, but the clinic is a barbaric place. And at the behest of Chris and Corrine, Olivia gets him out and takes him to the home of Harry's family, and they help him heal. And then once both men are doing better, they leave Foxworth Hall and travel the world together. And considering Corrine was so close to her brothers, it does seem odd that she wouldn't have stayed in contact with him through the years, right? And so when Chris died, it's almost like, why isn't she reaching out to her own brother? Like, why does she reach out to her parents who she ended things poorly with? I mean, Joel's not rich and her parents are, so there's that. But yeah, the fact that she and Joel were so close, so why are they not in contact still? I feel like that's kind of a plot hole in this version of the story. And then to talk about Nella, who is not in the book at all, nor are any of her family members. So she is a maid at Foxworth Hall who is black, and she is very kind to Olivia. And when Olivia first shows up, she is a good person who is so much more jovial and kind, and so she's very different from all of the other people, all of the other descendants of the Foxworth family. And so she and Nella start to get along. Although, Nella points out later, like, you think we're friends, and yet you don't know anything about me, so we're not actually friends the way you think we are. And we find out eventually that Nella had been raped by Malcolm in the past, and her daughter is his. And Nella's daughter, is the stepmom to Harry, the guy that Joel gets with. And at first I forgot that she was his stepmom, because when Joel and Harry got together, I was like, Joel's father is Harry's grandfather, so this is another inappropriate relationship because they're blood related. But then I remembered that no, they specify that she is Harry's stepmother. So this is one of the few relationships that does not involve incest. But Nella eventually, early on, before Alicia is pregnant, Nella gets fired by this Mrs. Danvers type lady who works at Foxworth Hall. There were definitely a lot of parts of this book, by the way, that were reminding me of Rebecca, including this lady, who again, she was very much like Mrs. Danvers. And to go on a tangent, this lady, so Olivia ends up firing this lady at one point, and then years later she shows up again blackmailing Olivia and Malcom, and then Olivia and Malcom end up killing her. So Olivia accidentally knocks her out, and then Malcom murders her. And this is another funny line, because that night Olivia says in voiceover, "At breakfast you want to kill your husband, but by dinner time you're helping him bury a dead body." So that, again, it was just so ridiculous. But anyway, so this lady fires Nella. However, when Olivia needs help with Alicia, she hires Nella back again. However, Nella resents the fact that Olivia got her to help with this situation with Alicia because it's so messed up. And so from here, Nella stays working for her, but she is very cold to Alicia, or to Olivia. And it isn't until like 15 years later that they finally warm up to each other again and actually become friends. And then after Malcom is paralyzed and Olivia takes control of everything, by the way, there is a scene when she goes to a board meeting full of men and puts them in their place. And this scene was reminding me of that iconic scene in Mommy Dearest where Joan Crawford, Faye Dunaway does the same thing. And considering that's also a very campy movie, I wonder if that was an intentional similarity there. But anyway, Nella, at this point, when Olivia is in control of everything, Nella, out of nowhere, tells Olivia that she has always wanted to become a singer. And so Olivia buys her a ticket to go fulfill her dream, and they throw a party, and Nella sings, and the lip syncing was pretty comical. But then years later, Nella comes to visit, and she sees how rigidly religious Olivia has become, and she has changed due to the influence of John Amos, who is also very racist and mean to Nella. And so Nella eventually leaves, seeing that Olivia has truly become a Foxworth. Hard, severe, cruel, and dark. And like I said, Nella and all of her family were not in the book at all, but, they turned this into a TV show, so of course they're going to have to add stuff. And so the inclusion of this character and her family was fine. And then this show has a lot of sexism, homophobia, racism. But what was annoying about it is the way the characters were meant to the way they call this out and the way they address it felt very modern. And so it took me out of the show at times because this takes place 100 years ago. And yet the characters have like modern day viewpoints on these topics, which just didn't seem accurate for the time. And so every time they called Malcom out for rape or racism or homophobia or him being mad about Corrine's abortion, I'm just like, this is the South in the 1920s and 30s. Like, I get they would have issues. Good people back then still had issues with the bad things people were doing. And yet the way they call him out on it, again, just felt so modern. Like, I want to see an evil man pay for the cruel things he says and does, but in a period piece, I want it to feel accurate. However, this is a Flowers in the Attic movie, so why am I expecting it to be historically accurate, But it's just so on the nose because they will straight up say things like, "You're a rapist and that's bad. Women have rights too." And then, "You should love your son and accept him even if he is gay." And it just didn't come across natural, right? Like, it didn't always feel like it fit and it didn't feel genuine. And you can tell that they specifically made a point to include so many modern day hot button issues that were currently being addressed. And so they made sure to include them and made sure to have characters be very direct and not leave the audience wondering about what's right and what's wrong. And it just felt borderline pandering, And I guess I feel kind of conflicted about this because on one hand, I like that the cast is more diverse and I like that they're telling stories of people who aren't just straight white people, essentially, right? So I like the inclusion of gay characters and stories of people who aren't white. And then again, it bothers me the way the people we're supposed to like more when they respond the way we in today's day and age would respond. That kind of bothers me. Again, it took me out. And yet the other part of me is like, these are good messages they're telling. So regardless of what their reason is for including it, and even if it wouldn't have been accurate to the 1920s, the 1930s, I'm also kind of like, what's the harm, right? Because it's not a bad message they're sending. So is it really that big of a deal? I don't know. It felt a little, again, pandering and like they were trying to fit in these storylines, again, just to appease the modern political climate or something. But hey, at least they were trying to do something good, right? And not appease a political climate that's really hateful. So it could be worse. So maybe I shouldn't make as big a deal of this as I am. I don't know. Let me know what you think down in the comments. And then one of the things I disliked most about this adaptation is the change to Olivia, like I said, because in the movie, they make her much more likable and sympathetic. Granted, you have the scene when she has the doctor come see Alicia and she lies to the doctor saying, because Alicia's like, they're keeping me captive here. But Olivia tells the doctor like, oh, she's crazy, going on, crazy ramblings. So obviously that was messed up. But even in the movie, she apologizes to Alicia later. Whereas in the book, again, she enjoyed messing with Alicia and she never sees Alicia before she leaves. And so, yeah, in the book, she just felt so much more complex and we saw her gradual descent. But even early on, we never particularly liked her. At least, maybe at first, but pretty soon after arriving at Foxworth Hall, we start to not like her too much. And yet we see why she is the way she is due to this abusive relationship she is in with Malcom. And so that's what made her more complex, is she's doing things we disagree with, and yet we can see what led her to that point. Whereas in the show, she's just made to be super likable up until like the last episode or something. Okay, so she might not be super likable until the last episode. Like, we dislike her at moments before this, but we see how she feels she is trying to do what is right time and time again. And so while sometimes she is making the wrong choice, but convincing herself it's for the best, the audience is like, you're making a bad call. And yet she does make the right choice often enough that the audience is able to side with her the majority of the time. Whereas in the book, I didn't feel conflicted about her since she often made bad choices and even enjoyed making those bad choices. And also I wanted to mention that in the book, there's a section where we read how Olivia, she's not seen as an attractive woman, and yet we do read that she has a beautiful head of hair. However, we never learn how she loses it later on, because in Flowers in the Attic, Chris sees her in her room and she wears a wig. So even if we don't learn how she lost her hair, I did like learning that her hair was her best feature, and so it makes sense that she wanted Alicia to cut off her hair as well as Cathy. And also in the book, Olivia is incredibly tall. She's like 6 foot, which is very tall for a woman. And this is something that comes up a lot because she is very self-conscious of it, and other women will make negative comments about her relating to her height. And so I thought this was an interesting detail, but then in the movie, the actress who plays Olivia is like 5'1" or something. She's very petite. And so I kind of was wishing, I like the actress, she did a good job, but I was wanting someone who had more of a commanding presence because of her height. And initially she's tall, and yet she doesn't like her height. And so, yeah, I don't know. I kind of like that detail in the book. Also, the fact that in the show, her father raised her to not believe religion, like study it, but don't embrace it or don't adopt it. And so she's very against religion, only to then have a 180. And so I didn't feel that was necessary either. In the book, she wasn't super religious at the start, but she had nothing against it. So, yeah. Oh, and then I also need to mention why she is scared to go into the attic. So in Flowers in the Attic, Corrine tells her kids that Olivia will never go into the stairwell that leads to the attic, let alone the attic, because she is claustrophobic, because when she was a child, her mom would lock her in a closet when she misbehaved. However, this is not the case in Garden of Shadows. And in Flowers in the Attic, Corrine, maybe she didn't know the real reason, and so maybe she just made this up herself. I don't know. So I'm not saying like the Garden of Shadows author is, not being accurate to the first book by missing this detail. I think this is one of those things where it's fine. They didn't stay true to something that was told to us in Flowers in the Attic because, again, maybe Corrine just didn't know why, and so she made up that backstory for herself, perhaps. But in the book, when Alicia is in the attic, she talks about being visited by Garland, and this is when she's kind of delusional. And so Olivia is like, wow, she's just not doing well mentally. But then the way Alicia talks about it makes it seem like she truly is seeing someone. And so Olivia is like, maybe Malcom is sneaking in there at night, and she thinks it's Garland. And so Olivia goes to some section connected to the attic to try to spy and see if Malcom is sneaking into Alicia's room. However, she ends up freaking herself out because it's dark and cramped and she feels rats. And so she, gets very flustered and scared and runs out and vows to never go in there again. Whereas in the show, soon after arriving, she is exploring the house and she goes into the attic despite Nella making it seem like it's bad to go up there, like, oh, it's off limits. But she goes anyway, and like in the book, she just kind of freaks herself out, basically. But then, when it comes to book versus TV show, the book wins. I do like the TV show a lot for reasons that are very different than why I like the book. Again, the show is just so ridiculous and at times hilarious, and it has so many unintentionally funny lines. But then there is the change to Olivia and just all of the characters. They're very black and white, whereas the book, they felt a bit more complex. But regardless, I still liked this show. I would still recommend it, but the book definitely wins and I really enjoyed it. And again, I would recommend this to you if you're a fan of Flowers in the Attic. Even if it was by a ghostwriter, I think it's worth it. And even though it doesn't have as much drama as the show, it's still pretty melodramatic in its own way, but it's just written better, in my opinion. So I think that wraps it up. There's a lot to get into with this one, but I think I covered all of the main things. So comment your thoughts down below. What did you think of this book and the TV show? But don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Bye.